In this video, I'm going to talk about some of the rules that we need to know about how to use quotation marks. Probably you've encountered quotation marks out in the world already, so hopefully at least some of this is a review, but I'm going to go over all of it because it can get a little bit nitpicky. So the first thing you need to know is the difference between a direct and an indirect quotation. And a direct quotation is probably what you think about when you say that someone quotes something. It's when you put the quotation marks on either side of what someone said or wrote, and the rule is that whatever's inside the quote needs to appear exactly the way that it was spoken or written. And that is called a direct quote. And the rule for direct quote is that you put quotation marks around exactly what was said or written. And the other rule is that before the quote you should put a comma. An indirect quote is really another way of describing a paraphrase. And a paraphrase is when you put in your own words what somebody said or wrote. So if we were to take this direct quote, Dad said, "You can go home with Joey today," and turn it into an indirect quote, it would be something like, "Dad said that I could go home with you today." You would be saying that to Joey, right? So this is not exactly like the dad didn't say, quote, "I could go home with you today," because then the dad would be the I, right? The way the dad said it is, "You can go home with Joey today." So the other thing you'll notice is that an indirect quote doesn't have quotation marks on either side, but also it's almost always introduced with the word that. So no quotation marks, but you put that before an indirect quote. The next thing you need to make sure to do is to pay attention to where you put the punctuation marks. So generally in America, we put the punctuation mark inside of the quote. So if you wanted to put a period, it would be you, period, quotation mark, and then you would skip a space and write the next sentence. In England, by the way, they put the period outside the quotation mark. So you might see it done a couple of different ways. But in this case, that question mark belongs to what's being quoted because the quote, "Who are you?" is a question. So in this case, the punctuation mark goes inside the quote because it's part of the quote. But what if I'm trying to comment on the quote? So for example, "Can you believe he said, 'I'm Bugs Bunny'?" In this case, the question mark and the exclamation point are about how I feel about what he said. So in this case, it goes outside the quotation mark. Because if it was inside, then he would be asking a question. "I'm Bugs Bunny?" Right? But that's not what's happening here. So you need to just be a little bit careful about where you put punctuation marks, especially ones that express an opinion, like a question mark or an exclamation point. Another rule is that you use italics when you're quoting or when you're referring to the title of something long, like a book, an album, a movie, something long, you would use italics. If you're handwriting, and you obviously can't write in italics, you would underline instead. If something's short, like a poem or a video on YouTube or a short story, you would put quotation marks around the title. I don't know why we have that rule, but that's the rule. If it's something long, italics. If it's something short, quotation marks. Finally, a bonus rule. Sometimes you want to quote someone who's quoting someone. So that would be a quote inside of a quote. So for example, using that earlier sentence about Dad saying something about Joey, it could be, "She said," and then here's the outside part of the quote. See that double quote, double quote. "Dad told me Joey can visit." So inside of this quotation, there's actually another quote. You see that? It's inside here. And that quote has a single quote. And that's just because otherwise it would get extremely confusing. So first you use double quotes, then you use single quotes. Notice again that you're always putting that comma before the quote because these are both direct quotes. And by the way, if there was a quotation mark inside of this sentence, you would use double quotes again. So you basically alternate between double quotes and single quotes. I hope this is helpful. If you have any questions, bring them to class.